PD session. Today's workshop in the 2026-30 series is on the Brightspace rubric tool. We're going to have a bit of a deep dive into the use of the tool. We're going to look at plenty of examples of how that tool is being used in different subject sites. It is more of a loose session than some of the specific tools where we walk through 2 or 3 new tools and are kind of racing. This one is a little bit more sedate in pace, I will say, because it allows us to actually spend more time unpacking what the rubric tool can do. That also means I encourage you to ask questions of all types whenever you feel like. You can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. I am joined this morning by Brooke Thornton from the Division of Learning and Teaching as well, and Brooke will be fielding your questions in the chat, pulling me up if I'm going wildly off track, etc. And we will sort of stop periodically to get into some of those questions where required. I have shared the link to the Padlet board that I'm presenting from today, but obviously with most of these sessions I like to spend more time in the tool itself within that interface, so this is more a bit of a dance card to guide me in what I'm looking through. And I'll be moving this off the screen in just a second, but I'm happy to reshare it where we need to. Essentially, what I'm going to be doing is looking at the Brightspace rubric tool in terms of what it does, where we access it, how do we build within it, how do we mark with it, talk a little bit about the master and session site divide. We still have that kind of disconnect going on, obviously. We're sort of getting close to 2 years into the Brightspace implementation at CSU, and we still have a lot of people doing things in one of these and not in the other. So I'm obliged to mention that in here as well. What else can we do with rubrics? We'll touch on all those things. I am happy to go down the rabbit hole a little bit in terms of things like supervised assessment, what we can do with rubrics in that space. And if people have more specific questions, targeted questions about rubrics that they've come here wanting an answer to, put it into the chat and we absolutely can engage with those. All right, so look, the first thing I'm going to do is show us a bunch of examples of people using rubrics in different ways. So I'm going to get the slide deck off the screen. Off you go. You can go over there. And I'm going to start looking at some examples. All right, so here we are in Brightspace, and the first one I'm going to have a look at is a midwifery subject that utilizes rubrics in an interesting way. So first part, I guess, is where do we find our rubrics? Start in your subject admin area, scroll down to the assessment section, and then find rubrics. And then at that point, you'll have your dashboard with your existing rubrics or your ability to create a new one. We will walk through that creation process a bit later on. But first up, let's have a look at how these guys are using them. Just a breakdown of what's going into the dashboard here. You'll notice that some of these have a little chain link icon next to them, and that tells us that this is currently associated with a particular assignment portal. Or a quiz portal. It's already been associated, so it can be used for marking, but it has not yet been used for marking. Whereas down here we have a padlock next to some of the others, and that means students have started to submit. You can't change the rubric. So that's one of the questions we quite often get asked is, I've got to make a change to it. How do I do that? If the students have started submitting, this icon will appear next to it, and our only option at that point is in fact to make a copy of this whole rubric, make our changes to the copy, and then associate the new rubric rather than the old one. Anyway, I'll get into that a little bit. The drop down next to each of these rubrics that we're looking at here will have things like editing, a preview option which will show us the student view of the rubric, and more importantly the view stats button, which we're going to look at what that gives you in terms of how to use the rubric tool itself. This is very important that you know where to come and find this particular function in the rubric tool. So if I preview this one, I can see that we have a rubric here with HC through to fail in terms of our uh, grade distribution for this. This part's marked out of 30. The text that they've copied, probably from the subject outline, also identifies how many marks each part can be worth. Above it here, it's showing me how many points have been put into Brightspace when the markers click on each of these sections. And if we scroll down, we can see, tally up those totals down the right, 5 different criterion sections, and then a separate area for satisfactory and unsatisfactory components of the task. So this rubric, in fact, has 2 different areas, one for dealing with scored components and another dealing with satisfactory, unsatisfactory components as well. So just because this one has 5 columns, it doesn't mean that every part needs to have 5. We can create different sections with different breakdown. And if we go right to the bottom, we can see that the whole thing is graded out of 100. Brightspace will interpret whatever that score out of 100 is in terms of HC through to fail, and that will be the mark for the rubric, not necessarily for the task. So if the task in Brightspace is worth 30% of the student's total grade, Brightspace will automatically convert whatever the score out of 100 is back to the weighting. So this is one of our significant differences between what we were dealing with previously in Blackboard, where people were trying to make rubrics that had the same value as the task so that it went sort of 1 for 1. We don't have to do that anymore. And in fact, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to do that because it means that when you're trying to figure out how many points are going into your different criterion areas, we get into very, very small numbers and sort of fractions of numbers trying to figure out what the split is. It's not necessary. In Brightspace, this number can be as big as you want it to be, and it will convert whatever that percentage or breakdown is back into the weighting of the task automatically. So this is a 2-section rubric that they're using in midwifery. You'll notice at the top we have a print button, which means we can get a hard copy, so can the students, or a PDF version if you want it. So that's the preview. If I was to click on the actual task itself, it opens up the edit view, but remember that this is locked because we're doing marking within it, and it won't let me change the point allocation. But note, it will let me modify the text in the rubric if I needed to. So if it's just a text change, you can still do that. All right, so that's our first example. Next one, we have a cardiology subject. And again, I'm going to go into the rubric section. Subject admin, assessment, rubrics. These guys, in the description for the rubric, have simply copied and pasted tables from elsewhere, maybe from the subject outline. This is not going to be available to students, so I'm not really sure why it's in there, but it is. And when we actually open up the rubric itself, we see that they have made a very, very simple and concise rubric where they have, there's no descriptors in here, but what I can see is that they're grading the students. This looks like a skills-based assessment or an OSCE, for example, where they're giving the student a score out of 6 for each of these. But the interesting thing for me is instead of HD through to fail, left to right, they've reversed it and decided to go fail through to HD. And you can do that in the rubric tool. If you don't like starting high and going low, you can reverse that if you want to. It's a little thing, but it doesn't mean we don't get asked it from time to time. So again, they get a score, it's out of 42, but the task itself is not out of 42, and it will convert that score in there. Down the bottom, we have an area in the rubric tool called overall score. This is not connected to the grade book. So whatever they're getting here in the total as it's tallied, that will be passed through to Brightspace. This area down the bottom is a visual representation to the student of what their score for this task is based on that number. So it's sort of disconnected, but it's what the student gets back that says, you got this for what's gone into the rubric. So it does need to be configured because by default this section talks about levels and it's meaningless to students. This is level 1, 2, 3, 4. And unless we actually give it meaning by labeling these things appropriately and talking about how many points equate to what, the student will get back sort of this weird text that talks about level 1, 2, 3, and 4. Anyway, I'll show you more of that later. Here we have a nursing subject, which means it's probably going to have 1 billion students in it. We'll have a look at the rubrics that they're using. Subject admin rubrics. And in this case, they do have OSCEs going in here. There is a breakdown for the markers explaining what the different scores 1 through 5 are. So this is probably being used in a workplace to assess the students doing particular skills-based assessments. And you'll notice that they're talking in here about attempt 1 in the language. So the way that this is used, in fact, is that when the markers, let's say they're in the hospital watching the students do what they need to be doing, looking at their first attempt, they'll get a grade in this rubric. And then if it doesn't work, or they need to do it again because they've been given 2 attempts, they'll then open a second rubric that's attached to the same assignment where they can then walk through that. So I might just sneak a peek at their assessment area and have a look. Where is the OSCE? Here it is. We can see, right, 470 students, 468 completed. Let's open up the dashboard. And if we went and had a look in here, I can see that we have an evaluation that's been done. Let's have a look at one that hasn't been done. And you can see attempt 1 and attempt 2. So they've attached multiple rubrics here, with the idea being that if you pass the first time, you're not going to need this second one. But if you do need the second one, the way the rubric tool works is the most recent score into a rubric will be the one that is passed through to Brightspace. So it will always update and override what was there before based on the most recent use. So if we have a look at those areas, and when we look at a rubric that's attached to an assignment, you get this condensed view on the right hand side. You can use your handlebars to open that up if you want, or you can also pop it out to full screen. And we can see that there are multiple areas to this rubric. The first section, there's no points allocated, so this is either you got it or you didn't. And you'll see that they've outlined their different criterion scales at the top. So they're not working on HC through to fail for this. They've got their own separate approach to marking when they're doing their skills-based assessments. And right down the bottom, after all of these out of zeros, so this isn't being scored out of 100, what we find, and again, here's another part of the skills-based assessment. I'm going to go right to the bottom. They do have one part that is scored, and that is, have they passed this attempt or not? And at the end of the day, passing it gives you 1 point, passed through to Brightspace, and it will interpret that as satisfactory or unsatisfactory for the task. So this is how you get a rubric to work alongside a satisfactory, unsatisfactory task. It will give you a number, but you need to think about where that 0 or a 1 is going to come from in the rubric. I'll stop there for a moment. Has anyone got any questions or comments so far as we go through these examples? Brooke, no one discontent in the chat?
No comments.
Excellent. All right. Well, if you do have any that spring to mind, by all means, pull me up. Let's keep looking at a couple of our examples. EPT 505, these guys have a multi-section rubric as well. This time, let's have a look in the assessment area. Inside assignments, and we find, well, they've got several different assessments. If we actually open just one of these to edit the assessment, you may or may not be aware that where you attach your rubrics is down here underneath evaluation, and there's the rubric that has been attached. In the event that you need to make changes to it or replace it, you would be removing the rubric over here and adding the rubric that you do want from down here. You can preview it from here, but you can't edit it from here, right? So this is just another way to access what's happening inside the rubric tool. All right, have we got anything outstanding here? 102, that's multi-section, and the other one's an OSCE. Maybe that'll do for examples for the moment, and we might spend some time building within the rubric tool itself. Jen.
Hi, Lachlan. How you going?
Good morning.
Good morning. Just a very quick question that
Yep.
kind of relates to rubrics, but just what are we going to do when in semester 2, when the subject outline pulls straight from CDAP?
Yep.
And CDAP has no capacity for tables and will only allow us 1,000 characters for our rubrics. What are we going to do in Brightspace then to make sure that there's consistency like across the board? Obviously what we have in Brightspace has to reflect what's in the subject outline. It's just a call for help if
Yeah, I hear you. I may have to take it on notice a little bit because
Sure.
I'm still waiting for a bit more information about the integration, and I'm
Aren't
hearing
we all though?
I'm hearing lists, I'm hearing templates. I'm not sure yet what the flow-on
Sure.
effect of those is for Brightspace, but I will get a response together for that. So thank you, and I will probably pop it into the chat from. For this after the session. One of the beauties of using Teams for these things is I can put a response back in here.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for that.
No worries, thank
But
you.
I don't
feel like we're
have
in
an
good
answer
hands
right here and
anyway.
now though.
No, if you're on our side in this, Lachlan, we're in good hands. So thank you for that.
I want an answer as much as you two because you're not going to be the last that asks me said question, I'm sure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so if I go back to my sandpit, for example, I'm going to show you one other rubric in this space, and that's to do with supervised assessment. And that's something that I am getting asked at the moment. So in this case, if we have a look at the rubric that's being used for this task, I'm looking at my dashboard at the moment. I have a student that has submitted something in here. So let's open the evaluation. There is my condensed area of the rubric. It's got 2 sections and scored out of 100. This is a bit too small for me, so I'm going to open it up in full screen. Let's have a look. Right, so my first area, which is talking about product criteria, if you hate that word, then I'm sorry, but this is talking about the artifact that the students are submitting first. And then if we scroll down, we'll see that there is, apart from the area for markers to be able to put in their initials underneath, scroll down to past these product criterion. Keep going, keep going, keep going. We then have the expectation that someone is going to come back when they're doing the mini Viva component and also add in their marks or their feedback for that second component. Now, the beauty of working within these rubrics is that a rubric will allow you to come back. Sorry, I've skipped past the bit that I was meant to. SC, SC, SC. Here we go. The supervised section. Right, so the markers that are handling the marking of the document that's been submitted will put in their scores in this first part of the rubric, click through, and then save as draft and move on. We can in fact do that now with Adam's submission, so why don't we do that? Let's go with that, 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 and there's still a few more, keep going. That should be it, I think. Yep, all right, so that's the end of marking the product. If I wanted to, I could click inside the criterion feedback area where I have cleverly put in marker initials underneath, with the idea being that I want to know who's marked this specifically for each different part of the rubric, and I can get them to put something in there. And I'll be right with you, Ali, one sec. And I also have the ability, if I need to modify these different scores that have come through in the rubric. So I can grade within a range if I'm not happy with the preset value that's been put in here. But then my first marking of this, of the product submission, is done. This has been auto-saved, which means that if I close this, what I'm seeing at the moment is the score that has come through from the part that's been marked. That then means that when the second part of this is being engaged with by people looking at the supervised component or the interviews, the mini viva, whatever you want to call it, they open the same rubric when they're ready at another point in time, go down to the other section and go, right, supervised component, let's go. Here it is. And then they can go through and add their contribution to it. Whether they put their initials in or not is up to you. Put that through, mark up these different parts, and now we have a score out of 100 for the whole task that has been done at 2 different points in time. So the rubric is auto-saved. It's now passed through that latest effort on top. There's our new score, and our marker can save draft, convene and publish, etc., etc. So let me stop there, and I'll get to you, Ali Ritchie. What can we do?
Just a slight tangent from the 2-phase marking, which does seem quite elegant. I just noticed then in that rubric, we're switching from satisfactory and unsatisfactory and using points rubrics for the first time this year.
Yep.
And we've got the grades at the top, but then you can only nominate 1 point value for each cell. So is there best practice in terms of, and then if you highlight that cell, by default, it's just going to give those points unless you override it in the criterion score? Is that right? So
that's correct.
I'm just noticing that for fail, we've got 0 points. For pass, we've got the bottom of the criterion.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm just, is there a good practice, like do you give the highest score for each criterion or what?
It's an excellent question. Let's get into that now. I'll open the builder and I'll talk through it, because there's some parts of this which are arbitrary. You have to do it, otherwise the tool won't work properly. And then there's a lot that is discretionary, right? So I'll talk about the way that I pass, kind of how I put this through myself.
Sorry, I didn't mean to railroad the
No, not at all. Let's call it an elegant segue, shall we?
Okay.
All right. I'm going to start in the rubric tool itself by building a new blank rubric, right? So I'm going to go into my subject site. Let's get rid of that. Open up subject admin, rubrics under assessment. Where are you hiding? There you are. And we'll build a new rubric. Okay, so I'll get to your bit in just a sec, Ali, but it's a part of this process, right? So the first part, when you're making your rubric, keep in mind that it needs to be located quickly. So you want a nice, concise way of labeling this. I suggest that you identify which assessment task you're going to be using it for. If you can, it's probably a good idea for you to identify the text type so people aren't guessing which assignment that's for. So if this was for something like a report or an essay or an observation or whatever it is, put it in there. If you have some kind of fancy name for your task that you also want to add to that, you can also put that in here. It's not that important. This is not going to be visible to the students. This is for you to identify which rubric you want to attach to which assignment. So you want it to be as accurate and easily identifiable as possible. Top right hand corner over here, you're going to notice an area that says status. By default, this will say published when you make a new rubric, and all that means is that you will be able to attach this to an assignment and use it. If you ever copy an existing rubric, this status will change to draft. If it's in draft, you won't be able to find it when you try and attach it. You have to change it to published when you're ready to use the rubric. That's the only reason that I sort of flag this for you. It must say published, otherwise you're just not going to be able to find it. All right, underneath the heading here, we've got 3 different sections: type, analytic versus holistic. There is no difference to these two except for the fact that a holistic rubric in Brightspace language means single criterion only. It will only give you 1 row and that's it. If that has no value to you at all, or you accept that even when we're using multi-row rubrics, we can always delete rows that we don't want, you'll probably quickly realize that this is a bit useless. So always leave it on analytic by default, and you decide how many rows, how many sections you want to have. You'll notice that by default, it gives you 4 of these columns and it's talking about levels. So again, not much good to us. We can add more columns if we need to by clicking on this plus here on the left-hand side. And then we start customizing that with the language that we need, whether you're using your HD through to fail continuum or others like those skills-based observations we saw. They were using 1 through 6 because that's what they use in the discipline when they're doing the observations. If you want to put the percentages in brackets, etc. next to it, that's completely up to you. If you want it to absolutely mimic what's in the subject outline in terms of the language used, or if it's the full words, again, your discretion. You can do those things. I'm just putting that in here to give you an idea. In terms of your criterion that you create, you have the ability to add additional rows if you need to, and you'll see down here, add criterion will give me another row. So as many of those or as few of those as you like, and then you can populate each of your criterion, again, as in your subject outline. I don't think it hurts to actually have the word criterion 1, criterion 2, criterion 3 at the start before your labels, because it makes it easier for the students to then locate which ones specifically if you're talking about that in the feedback, etc. Sometimes people don't have those in their outlines and people are trying to find which criterion they're actually talking about. Very simple thing, even the number 1, 2, 3, whatever. Quick labeling means you can quickly find what's being referred to. Then you can populate, copy paste your text. There is no way to quickly and easily copy and paste an entire table from elsewhere, Excel or otherwise, into this tool. You got to do it cell by cell. When you try and do it and you remove that information from somewhere else, it's going to give you a message that'll ask about formatting. If I can find something quick and nasty here where I can do that, Excel, that'll do. Give me some text. Well, that'll do. It's just one word, but it will work exactly the same. I've grabbed something from Excel, Control V, and then it says remove or keep. Remove the formatting. And then at that point, hopefully, if you've just selected the text and not an entire cell as I have here, it will copy and paste that nicely for you. You can put tables into these if you like, but consider what this is actually going to look like for the students. And if you're not sure what it's going to look like for the students, you always have the ability in the rubric next to the drop down to preview it. Hit the preview up the top and then you see this is what students will see currently when they look at the rubric. So you don't have to jump out and jump into a student view or anything like that. Just use that preview option that's next to the heading up top. All right, let's talk about points. I didn't actually finish talking about my menus at the top here. Analytic, holistic, we talked about. By default, you'll see that scoring points is selected. And what that means is that you set one set of values across the top, and that will then apply to all of the rows in the rubric, which isn't often something that we end up using. There's usually some kind of variation between the different criterion. If that's the case, I encourage you to select custom points. And now you get to customize the point values against each criterion. So again, it comes down to how you've actually split up the task, the different weightings for the different criterion, etc. Custom points allows you to diversify that. The last option that we have in here, actually let me finish the first thing, Lachlan. You can also select no score. No score means there's no numbers going in here, and this is what we would call a qualitative rubric. So there's no points being passed through to Brightspace. The student's going to get back a document which gives them a visual indication of how they've performed, but there aren't any numbers being passed through to Brightspace or the gradebook. That's what the no score option is doing. I'm going to leave it on custom. And then the very last option we have in here is reverse the order. So if you remember before, we were looking at small to high numbers, left to right, you can reverse the order and then it will switch them around for you. So you don't have to be dealing with HD through to fail. You can go fail through to HD however you like. That's all that button does for you. All right, now we can talk about scores. For the rubric tool to work, for it to tally properly, so down the bottom, if I look at my total underneath, this is currently out of 20. For this to work properly, I need, for the HD column, the first column to always be set at the maximum value. There is no choice here. It must be set as the maximum, and that means that when your markers choose this, they have to be aware that they're going to have to adjust it down if they don't think the task was worth 100%. That part is arbitrary. All of the other values that you put in here are at your discretion, right? So if we're talking about HD is normally obviously 85% plus, and your distinction being 75 through to 84, for example. Don't kind of quote me on exactly how this looks. I'm just for an example here, 65 through to 84. You get the idea. And we might deal with failures 0 to 49. All right, so this one, as I've said, has to be max. Let's change this value to something a bit higher so it's a bit easier for us to work through. All right, so I've said that the first column has to be maximum. The rest of them are at your discretion. So if you choose to go middle of the road and you figure out that, okay, I want this to be 80, which Brightspace has said that's what it's doing, fine. If you decide you want it to be the top of the band because this is the top of the band and that's your precedent across the board, then you can say, fine, this one's going to be 8.4. This one's going to be, what have I done here, Lachlan? 74. 7.4 as an example. If pass was then 0 through to, no, that's no good, 50 through to 64. So we said that this is top of the band is 6.4 and this is top of the band, so 4.9. That is a perfectly legitimate way to approach this. And you then have that communication with your markers, for example, and say, when you're using this, if they haven't hit the top of that band, you need to adjust it down with that manual criterion adjustment. I'll stop there for a second. Nikki, you had a question?
Lachlan, I've had a bit of an issue with some markers giving, 0.4 and things. So is it better to have, 6.5, keep it to half and full mark, 6.5, 7 and so on?
I don't know about better. It makes things less complicated or more straightforward. And usually it comes down to having chosen carefully how much you want the weighting areas to be. So considering what I said to you before about the total in the rubric doesn't have to be the same as the task weighting. It actually means that you make these sections scored out of as much as it's going to make it easier to mark the thing. So to break it down. So I think as long as that weighting is the same as what it is in the subject outline, then you're okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my preference is to not have minute numbers and kind of fractions of things. I like to deal with things in half marks if I can, but every academic is different in this space, and some of them want the bottom, some of them want directly in the middle. The reality is, unless your markers are across the fact that they need to scrutinize the default mark and make adjustments where necessary going up and down, and that everyone's approaching it the same way, there's always that risk potentially of let's say it not being done consistently across the board.
Yeah, I've got one marker that always.
Yeah. So I mean that comes down to your benchmarking, your moderation, your communication with your markers, all that stuff. And again, once they're marking in their own space, it's almost like the door to the classroom's closed. They're doing what they want anyway, kind of in a way, which is always a bit of a risk at that point. Yeah, I mean, my preference is to have it nice and clean and simple. I've seen some that have 6 decimal points in here, and that I don't think is particularly helpful. But it's someone that's gone in and said what is exactly half of that, or what is it? So you have that discretion, but it's going to make it less interesting. One thing I will point out is that you do have the ability with a rubric to hide the scores, the numbers that are being used for the calculation from the students. So whilst we're talking about the scoring and how our markers use this, you've got to keep in mind what's it going to look like to the student when they get tiny fractions, and then they want to come back to you with, I want to remark, I think I should be getting 0.2 more or 0.3 or 0.4. If you want to remove that aspect from the equation, down the bottom of the rubric tool, underneath our options area, you have the option to decide whether or not you want the rubric hidden entirely, whether you want the scores to be hidden, so they're just seeing the actual criterion level that they've achieved for the task and not focusing on parts of marks, like how many points and whether they were particularly close or not or whatever. Or also whether or not you want the rubric to be hidden until the task has been marked and then visible. So this is probably the most common combination that markers choose with rubrics in Brightspace. Keep this hidden until you've actually published it and you're ready for it to go back to the students. And some markers don't want them to see the scores, others don't care. So that's probably the most common option that we see in that space. They get the rubric from the subject outline, that's the gospel in the first sense. But if you don't hide the rubric and leave it as visible, where it's visible to them is actually in the assignment portal when they hit the submit button. Then it takes them through all of their academic integrity disclaimer stuff, artificial intelligence disclaimers, and then there's a rubric that's 4 pages long. After they scroll through all of that, then they have the ability to actually browse for their file and submit the assignment. Slight kind of empathy lens on for me is saying that you can get the rubric in other places. I'm not going to make you scroll through all of that before you can even submit your assignment. Ali.
Does hiding the scores hide the overall score as well, or just the criterion scores?
Just the criterion scores, but the overall score, it'll tell you the label, not the point value. So
okay, and then
yes,
so when you publish their results, they'll get their overall mark for the assessment, just won't
they
see
get the Brightspace mark for the assessment, right? So not the rubric score.
Right, but that rubric total score is what's being pushed to Brightspace.
Absolutely.
Well, gradebook, yeah.
Yep, that's what it does. It'll pass through that score from the rubric, that percentage, if you will, and then convert it to whatever the actual task weighting is.
Thank you. My
pleasure. If you do, remember we were looking at descriptions on rubrics before in the rubrics dashboard. They're only visible to your other sort of teaching team staff. If you also want them to have a description for the rubric or instructions sitting above it in the gradebook, you would put it in here as well. Right, so you can populate a description of the rubric if you have particular instructions around how you want it to be used. Pop it in here. Not visible to the students. All right. There's a couple of other bits and pieces I want to go over in this tool. Whilst we're looking at the options, we were looking at visibility a second ago. Right down the bottom, there's some stuff that talks about advanced availability. You can ignore all of this. We don't currently have these parts of Brightspace turned on, so they're irrelevant. Right, so don't worry too much about it talking about competencies and e-portfolio, etc. We don't use those Brightspace tools at the moment. All right, let's go back to our rubric section and continue with what we want to do with this. You may recall from the rubric I showed you before, there was an area for the marker to provide their initials or other comments underneath each of the criterion. So Brightspace allows your markers to put in feedback underneath when they're marking. It also allows you to preset text inside those areas. So if you have preset text that you want a HD for this criterion to say to the students in terms of you've done this, and this amazingly well, etc., and you want that to be in there, you can populate that text in here. What I was doing with it was simply putting in an area for markers to identify themselves so that they know they're expected to do that. And this probably comes more from the OSCE or skills-based assessment scenario where people are on a mobile device somewhere, or the vet science students, etc. They're out in the field and they actually need to do that marking quickly and easily, but they also want to be identifying who's doing what. The markers will be able to click on that cell and put in their initial there, etc. if they need to. So you can put in preset feedback underneath each of the criterion if you want. And then the last thing I want to show you in here is that you have the ability to create different sections, which Brightspace calls criteria groups. You can provide those in the rubric as well by hitting add criteria group, not criterion. That'll just add to this top part. If we hit add criteria group, we now get a completely different section. And as I said to you before, it doesn't need to look the same as the first part. So if your second section only has 2 areas, like satisfactory, unsatisfactory in it, I can get rid of 3 columns. So get rid of that, get rid of that, get rid of that. I can call this whatever I like. If I want to call this red and blue, I can. If you want to call it satisfactory, unsatisfactory, you can. If you want the points here to be different entirely, even if you want them to be worth nothing at all, you can do that as well. So each of your different sections or your criteria groups in a rubric can be purposed however you need them to be used. Right? So quite often people say, I need a section around academic integrity, but it doesn't have a point value, or it only needs to be worth, only having satisfactory, unsatisfactory areas or something. You can carve out as many of these criteria groups as you want, as many sections as you want in the rubric. It doesn't have to all be in the one area. And I think Ali was talking before about the prospect of having different marking happening at different times, for example. And quite often people will create separate submission portals with separate rubrics attached to each for different parts of the same task, particularly if they are happening at different points in time. So I showed you through marking using the same rubric, just coming back to it at different points in time with that supervised assessment. You may have significant periods of time between different parts of the same assessment. And my advice to you at that point is to create different submission portals with each of those different dates on it. It's very easy for us to put all those different columns together in the gradebook and say, right, there's part 1, part 2, part 3. They can all have their own rubric, and that marking can be attentioned discreetly if you want that to be the case. So there's a choice that you have, either trying to use a single rubric to do it all and come back to it at different points in time, or multiple portals, multiple due dates, multiple rubrics. That's a choice you get to make. I'm going to stop there for a second because I can see we have some questions going on.
Yep, Ali's got one. Lachlan, do they have to be the same scoring system, like qualitative and custom points?
It does. But if you choose custom points, I guess you can just decide what you want the points to be, whether it's 0, whether it's the same as the others, whether it's something completely different. So it's going to use the same scoring system that's up the top, but given that within custom points, you can always change these to be whatever you like, even if it's zeros and ones. What you will have in the different sections is the ability to decide how many columns, for example, and if you're then deciding there's only going to be 2 and they're not going to be scored the same way, then that's up to you to decide what they look like. They can be used completely differently to the way that your other sections are. Does that make sense, Ali? I'm not sure. Yep, okay. All right. We're tracking fairly well here time-wise. Let me consult my board and see what other things I was meant to talk about that I haven't. We talked about the overall score section down the bottom. No, we haven't. Let's do that. All right, down the bottom when you create your rubric. By default, the overall score area does the same thing as the rubric did at the start, giving us these 4 levels. They're basically meaningless. And they're also based on numbers when we started the rubric rather than maybe where we ended up. So what I need to do is make sure that this matches whatever my grading scheme is for the task. So in this case, we've been talking about HD through to fail for this task. The students are going to get a weighted value. So I need to make this look the same. So I'm going to add an additional column I'm going to change the language that's in here, HD through to fail. DI, credit, pass, fail. And you'll notice that this talks about or more over here on the right-hand side, which means we need to figure out what those percentages are going to be for this value. So again, if I had made my rubric out of 100, which I strongly advise you to do if you're not sure one way or the other, this would be much simpler. So maybe I'll do that now. How many criterion areas have I got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's go 20, 20, 20, 20. What's that give me? 80. One more. That'll do. And now down the bottom, we're getting a rubric that's out of 100. Now I can set my overall score values. It's going to be 85% or more on the rubric is going to be called a HD. Then distinction, 85, no, not 85, 75, 65, 50, and 0 or more. Right, so as long as the score on the rubric for the student comes up a number out of 100, it's going to be classified as one of these for the students, and down the bottom they will see you've achieved X for this task. You can hide those score values as we did down the bottom. You can also provide more description underneath for what you want the students to see when they've achieved that overall mark for the task, if you want more description in there underneath each. Right? They will see that. They might not necessarily see the score if you have hidden the scores from the students. Okay, so you can use that overall score, but it is important because if you haven't taken the time to specify what these values actually mean, this is going to come back to as something potentially meaningless to the students, and they'll go, well, it says level 4 and 74%. What does that mean? Why doesn't that say the same thing as what they're expecting to see elsewhere? So take the time to customize the overall score area so that it is meaningful, because that's what the students will see at the bottom of their rubrics. All right, we talked about options. We had a look at some examples in sites. We looked at the difference in the rubrics between the different point types, no score points and custom points. Yeah, I'm on track there. Rubric stats. I have to show you this. All right. You may recall, and it auto saves by the way, so there's no save button somewhere for you. You can just close this. You may recall before that I said that inside the rubrics menu to the right of each of the rubric names, there is a drop-down area that includes this option called View Statistics. This is incredibly important because it will allow you to do a type of moderation of a task by stealth. And what I mean by stealth is you don't need the task to be published for marking to be completed. You can do it progressively. And this tool is actually a brilliant way of doing that, and a reason why we want the rubric to be as accurate as possible. If I can pick on one of those nursing subjects before that had all of those students, let's have a look and see if this will do the job. How about that one? Clinical examination, that sounds very nursing-y, doesn't it? Yep, that'll do. All right, so if I go into the subject admin area for this subject, find the rubric section, and I'm now going to find the rubric that was used to mark one of those observations, the OSCEs. I'm going to go into View Statistics. And our first screen in here is not particularly impressive. It gives us no information. Move along to this second area that says Competency Activities. We now get an initial dashboard that says how many have been marked using that rubric. 436. So I get a current indicator of how many of those rubrics, how many have been marked. I don't need them to be published. So I can see at the moment how much of the marking has gone on. And this is in real time. Right? So I have that number. I can also see what the average mark is currently. Okay, that's sort of helpful. That's not a bad starting point. Let's go into the actions area on the right. I now get a dashboard that gives me the split of who's gotten what. So imagine that this says HD through to fail. It's going to tell me what the split is currently in the marking. Now I can get into individual criterion statistics if I want them, which will tell me how students have performed in each of the different criterion in the rubric. Not too bad, and particularly useful, I guess, if you're reviewing the task afterwards for which parts have gone well or not well and need adjustment. But the best part of this tool is the last area called individual statistics. This is where the money is, because what we get in here is a breakdown of all of the students and their grades and their markers when they've been marked. This is a marking date stamp, so you actually get a breakdown then of when the markers have engaged with it. And you can also filter, if you don't want to look at all however many 100 students there are at once, you can group by section. So if I said, I only want you to show me Bathurst distance students for this task. Okay, it's now giving me a list of all of those. I can then use this assessor column and it will show me which markers have done which papers. And if you've set up marking teams using the groups tool, which a lot of people are doing, you can also filter by groups. So at that point for this task, if I wanted to say, show me, let's find my marking groups. Are there marking groups? Here we go. Marking of assessment 2, group 2. How's that going? And that will then show me how much of that marking has been done. This is in the past, this session, so I can already see that these have all been done. But this will actually allow me, during the live submission process, the convener, for example, can see how much of the marking allocated to whoever group 2 is, or the second marker, or the third marker, etc., has been completed. So you can use this tool progressively to check on how the marking is progressing. I'll stop there. Ali says, do the different groups... No, that was an old question. Never mind. So does anyone have any questions about using the rubric stats tool? You need to play around with it a little to get familiar with it. But this last tab, the individual stats tab, is actually quite invaluable because it allows you to do a form of moderation and benchmarking progressively as the students start submitting their assessments. You don't have to wait until all the marking has been finalised and published for you to be able to see how the marking is progressing. You can check on it live because it's actually looking at the progress of the rubrics, not the Brightspace assignment area as such. That's why this is kind of a sneaky way of being able to check on the submission progress of an assignment. Probably doesn't help that this is saying satisfactory, unsatisfactory for you. I could have shown you an example with HD through fails, but hopefully you get the idea of what you can do with rubric statistics. All right, we are just about at time. So I'm happy to hang around for a minute if people have got other specific questions or don't want to talk about the rubric tool at all and want to ask me other things. I'm happy for that as well. But with that, I will stop the recording and say a big thank you to